I really hold the idea that we can't avoid pain, and sometimes it's really, really hard to turn that into purpose. And even when we turn it into purpose, we still have to hold space for that pain. And they can coexist. Growth and grief can coexist. Pain and purpose can coexist.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Behind the Spotlight, and I'm your host, Kelly Wright. Today we have a wonderful guest with us, Susan Caddell, and she
Mhm.
specializes in grief support and does many work helping people turn their pain into purpose. Please welcome Susan.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's an honor to have you here. And I just like to jump right into things. I wanted to ask if you could share what led to you dedicating your life's work to the study and the support of grief. Was there a specific moment or experience that ignited your passion for this type
Mhm.
of topic?
Absolutely. For me, it came in the 1990s when I had a number of friends who were infected with HIV and AIDS and died. And at the same time, I was having babies, my friends were dying, so I was experiencing these two ends of life and the beginning and the ending, and it was so easy to talk about birth and so hard to talk about death and grief. And through my years of working in the area, I realized that we we don't have language for grief. We may used to have had, but we don't anymore. And so I've come to this idea that we need to work on grief literacy and improving people's ability to talk about it, to recognize it in themselves so that they can see it in themselves and they can recognize it in others and they can hold space for grief. And yeah, and I just hope that we collectively develop language that I didn't have when I was going through it.
Mhm. Yes, wonderful. So, the name of your organization is Grief Matters. What's the core message behind that name, and what inspired you to start this work?
The core message is that grief does matter. I mean, it's sort of that straightforward, and we need to address matters of grief. We need to do more education. We need to, recognize it in other people, and it's all the matters of grief and how much it matters to us, how important it is to us. So yeah, the name, kind of came about, and it's basically been a passion project of myself and my colleague Mary Ellen McDonald. We are the co-founders, and we're both academics. Mary Ellen McDonald is a medical anthropologist and works at Dalhousie University, and I am a recently retired social work academic, and we both do research and about grief, and I teach about grief and palliative care in the social work program that I still teach in, even though I've retired from academia. And we just thought we needed to move outside of the university. And so we created Grief Matters to be a national organization to facilitate conversations and increase grief literacy.
Yes, the increasing the grief literacy is very important and very underrated, I believe. So
Mhm.
that's magnificent. What's a common misconception people have about grief, and what have you learned through your work that challenges that idea?
There's just so many misconceptions, but the one that comes to mind immediately is that we shouldn't talk about someone. If someone's died, we shouldn't talk about them. And that we might, if I'm with someone whose partner has died, say, if I mention it, it's going to make them sad. And the reality is the person who's grieving, they don't forget it. If they don't talk about it, it's because they're not sure that it's a safe place to talk about it. And if the other person opens that door, worst case scenario is that the person who's grieving says, you know what, today's not a good day. But they get the message that you're an okay person to talk to because you've opened that door. And, there are cultural norms about saying people's names, but we can still talk about people without saying their name. But in other cultures, it's really important to say names, right? So, I mean, obviously, it depends on relationship and how we bring that up. So that's really, really important. That's one of the big myths that we hear time and time again from people who are grieving, that people avoid them. They don't want to talk about it. It's like the notion that it's a contagious disease, right? And so you have to avoid it. And it's not catching. So that's one. I could go on for, there's more.
No, that was divine. Thank you. So I also, something you said sparked this for me to ask. So sometimes grief is seen as something to get over, you know.
Mhm.
How does
Mhm.
your approach differ from that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We really recognize that grief isn't something to get over, that grief stays with us. It may well change over time, but there isn't a timeline. Years ago, I was facilitating a grief support group in the community, and people would say things like, well, so and so came over and said that I should, it, it's time to put away the photographs, or it's time to do this. And there isn't a timeline. And it's really important that we respect people's own timelines, and grief stays with us. And if you lose someone significant in your life, that's never ever going to go away. It may well change over time. Like, I in the 1990s, I had many friends who died, and I think about them a lot, and I think about it differently now. It doesn't hit as hard. Sometimes it's about, oops, thinking that it's just something, oh, so and so would have loved to hear that story or whatever, and it's poignant rather than hurtful. So might change over time, but it never goes away.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So for someone who's grieving right now, what is one piece of advice that you would give them to help them th get through today?
For someone who's grieving, I'd say tap into your network. Don't be afraid to bring it up and say what you need. And it's a test, because sometimes when you do that, you find out that you think that someone who you think is there for you isn't actually there for you. And then sometimes other people will show up, do the things and say the things and be the things that you need. And so for the grieving person, I mean, I don't want to put too much onus on the grieving person either, because what I really want is for people around a grieving person to know that that's what they need to do. They need to step up. They need to check in. They need to offer something concrete rather than saying, let me know what you need, because let me know what you need says that you have to decide it. But yeah, so I mean, it's a relationship, right? And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we don't want to put all the weight on the person who's already grieving to need to reach out. A grief literacy for me is really about educating the people around people who are grieving, so that there isn't so much pressure and burden on the person who's grieving.
Nice. Nice. In your experience, what are some of the most helpful tools and practices for navigating grief?
I think knowing that it's incredibly individual, and that no two experiences are the same. So for instance, two adult children of a parent who dies are going to have different grief experiences because they had different relationships with that parent. Similarly, one person could experience different losses differently. So, my example of having numerous friends who died, there were so many losses in such short order, and I was so unable to talk about it, that was a very different experience for me than later on when my aging father died, and I felt well supported and I had the language by then. And, it was very, very different. And so the same person can have different grief experiences depending on the relationship, depending on the circumstances, but also depending on relationship, like two people in similar situations can have wildly different experiences. So grief is extremely personal, and there there isn't a wrong way of doing it. There's no right way and there's no wrong way. It's up to if it's you, it's up to you to decide what works for you. And and hopefully that's not going to be curling up in a corner and never going out again. And like, if that's where you are, because, for some people, it can hit very, very hard. And hopefully they have the networks who will come and, surround them and hopefully move through that part of it. But that it doesn't need to be necessarily assumed that everybody's going to have that kind of reaction.
Makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. So, grief comes in many different forms, not just death. Can you speak on how grief shows up in other events, like a major life change, a job loss,
Mhm.
a health
Mhm.
diagnosis, maybe?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much grief. The opening to the movie Love Actually is the phrase, love is all around us. And I always think about that as, yes, love is all around us, and so is grief. Grief is all around us. And when we lose an opportunity, we applied to for a fellowship or a job or something and we didn't get it. That we might grieve that. We might not. But when there's lots of instances of grief, there's grief in a diagnosis, for instance, there's the grief in the loss of a home. There's grief where there's a change, there's the potential for grief. And so I always think about when my first child was born, there was a little bit of me that was also grieving that I was this independent adult who didn't have any dependence on me. And so it was a life change. And then, but it was, and at the same time, it was an amazing event. So there's lots of areas of ways in which we experience loss where there's the potential for grief and it can coexist. It can coexist with joy. It can coexist with happiness. It doesn't it's not one or the other. Grief can happen in all kinds of circumstances.
And when that situation or circumstance shows up and
Mm,
now we're grieving a situation,
mhm.
what's the best way for friends and family to support someone in that grieving process? And what's, in your opinion, some things they should avoid doing or saying?
So I think what's really important is first of all just acknowledging that grief is possible in those circumstances, and so making sure to check in on the person and not just checking in once, but checking in not to be horrible, but like I mean I think sometimes people check in and think, okay, well they say they're fine, and so I don't have to check in again. But you might need to check in depending on the circumstance. You might just need to check in, a day later, a week later, but do it again. And because circumstances change, depending on the circumstance, there might be more news about an event or something, and just so I think family and friends and the network around people should think about checking in again. And sometimes it's just sending a text message that says, you don't need to respond, but I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. So it's just saying I'm here, but not necessarily asking for an answer. So that's one thing I would say to family or friends is just send a text message or whatever kind of message you send to people and just say, I'm here. You don't need to answer back if you don't feel like it. But it's just saying that I'm here and know and so the person knows that you're there. And I think one thing to avoid is making assumptions that this is how things should be happening because it is such an individual process and it's going to hit so differently. I think because you're in California, I think about like there were devastating wildfires and people lost their homes. And even if people weren't directly affected, almost everybody in that area knew somebody who was directly affected. And that can hit people enormously differently. And we need to hold space for that and not diminish that. it's okay to feel bad or to feel grief and to be confused and even if it's not directly affecting you. So there's just a few of the things that can happen.
I think when I was younger, I was guilty of that, but have learned a lot of empathy and things for other people when they're experiencing it, but I'm not going through it. I've learned
Mhm.
to, like you said, hold that space for them, have some empathy for them, and knowing that they're dealing with something super traumatic, and it's affecting them differently than it's affecting me.
Yeah.
But I just want to be more empathetic to what they're dealing with. Definitely something I've learned with time. I think I would expect, like my friends or my family to be handling a situation the way I would be handling it. And I've learned through my work and working with so many people and having so many experiences with clients that different people handle situations different ways, and I have to let them deal with their thing the way they deal with it, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. That's very wise. And I think the other part of that is that acknowledging that it might hit later. Again, when I was facilitating a grief group, sometimes we would have people show up who had experience. I mean, in that case, it was just death related, but sometimes people would show up like years after the person had died, and they had never been to a support group. They had never felt the need for a support group. And then suddenly, sometimes they knew that what happened and why that need changed. And sometimes they had no idea, but they just felt that they needed to do it now. And kudos to those people who recognize, you know what? It's been 7 years, but now I didn't need it before and now I do. Or, this is hitting me hard. And so that again, it's so individual. And so I think some of what you're saying too, Kelly, is that, the way you and I can go through the same experience and we might have very similar reactions and we might have wildly different reactions. And that's important that we acknowledge that. And I think that's part of understanding grief is how differently people can react to it.
In your work, what is one of the most profound things you've learned from working with different individuals and how people experience and deal with grief differently?
I think one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the ways in which culture and religion influence, rituals and also individuals. Because, just because someone is of a particular faith doesn't mean that they actually want to sort of follow, like some faiths have very, sort of rigid rules around very structured rules, not rigid in a bad way, but structured rules around, timing when and the response to a death and, what to do with the body and things like that. Even when people are doing that and observe that, it doesn't mean that that's fully there, that, that it's meeting all of their needs. And so, yeah, I think what I love sort of digging into is how people memorialize others. And so sometimes that is in observing a ritual, like a time old ritual. And sometimes it's about creating something new. And sometimes it's about both. And one of the parts of the work that I've done that I've loved the most has been talking to people about tattoos and tattoos that they've got to memorialize people who have died and, you know, how they picked the image and how they picked the placement on their body and, what the story is and how they tell the story when people ask them about the tattoo. And like, it's just fascinating, fascinating to hear those stories.
Okay. And so when working with someone and dealing with grief, that type of work goes beyond a simple conversation. Can you
Mm.
talk us through what a typical session or a period of working with you might look like? And what tools and frameworks do you use to help people move from feeling stuck to feeling empowered?
Well, I mean, it's been a long time since I worked with individuals, and more of my work has been with working with, sort of groups and communities, and I think one of the and classes, but groups of people, and so I think one of the first things is, starting with talking about my understanding of grief so that, it sort of puts it out there and that people can connect with different parts of it. And, talking about myths and sort of one of the formats that I love is for sort of guiding some of these discussions is using a death cafe model, which is basically having people come into a casual atmosphere and sit at tables and, have snacks and just have sort of questions on the table that if they don't have sort of a conversation that starts sort of spontaneously, that they can pick up a question and sort of talk about that. And so just trying to facilitate conversations. And so it's about opening doors for me. And I think even if I was translating that to working with an individual, I think that's what I would be doing is asking the questions and asking about the stories and asking about when it's someone who's died, asking about that person. When we know that someone has died, we tend to immediately say, I'm sorry for your loss. And I encourage people to say, oh, tell me about that person and open that door to a conversation rather than I'm sorry for your loss is just it's what we think we're supposed to say, but it kind of shuts down conversation. So, you know, open up the conversation.
Yes, I like that. And then the question, tell me about that person. It gives the
Mhm.
person an opportunity to highlight them, reflect back on some good
Yeah,
memories.
yeah,
That's
yeah, absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. So also grief can be a very isolating experience. How do you
Mhm.
help people rebuild their connection and find a new community after a significant loss?
Yeah, and I think that's part of why we've been working around grief literacy is that it shouldn't be so isolating. Even though it's very individual, it doesn't need to be isolating because it's just it shouldn't mean that I'm being cut off from others. And I think again the idea of without putting too much onus on the person who's grieving, but to think about what it is that you need and asking people for that. And unfortunately sometimes a significant loss changes people's networks. And sometimes people find out that the people that they thought who were there for them would be there for them are not there for them, and others, surprisingly step up. So if you can sort of put out an ask and see who shows up, that's a really important thing.
Nice, nice, really
Mhm.
good. So, lastly, I wanted to ask, what is the ultimate goal of your work that you do in your classes and in your group settings? Is it to feel normal again, or is it something completely different entirely?
I think the ultimate goal is to increase everyone's ability to understand loss and grief in all its forms and have ideas about how to engage in conversations, you know, how to challenge myths and just I think I would yeah, ultimately I'd love to see media campaigns. I'd love to see grade school and high school education programs. Like we we are never not going to experience loss. We can't remove that from people's lives. What we can do is equip everybody with tools to engage in conversation before a loss or after a loss and be prepared, be better prepared for it. I don't think we ever are fully prepared for a significant loss when it happens, but if we engage in some of those conversations beforehand, we might ease the shock and trauma a little bit. So yeah, that's the ultimate goal.
Yes, very good. Very good. I like that. So I just want to thank you so much for being here. And I always end with my last little question. Susan, why don't you tell everyone what it means to you to turn pain into purpose?
I think what it means to me is recognizing that one is what we hold in one hand and the other is what we hold in the other hand, and that we're always going to have both those hands. That even when we have purpose, it's not gonna completely take away the pain. Like it's not, even though if we're right-handed, we're still gonna use our left, right? I mean, we're still gonna, if we have two hands, we're gonna have two hands. And so, I think about that I really hold the idea that we can't avoid pain. And sometimes it's really, really hard to turn that into purpose. And even when we turn it into purpose, we still have to hold space for that pain because sometimes it's just going to rear its head and we're not going to be able to avoid it. And they can coexist. Growth and grief can coexist, pain and purpose can coexist. And so, yeah, I think that's what I think about. And I ultimately, I think when we're holding space for grief, we're also holding space for joy.
Beautiful, beautiful said. Thank you. Thank you. So, again, I just want to thank you so much for being here, sharing your truth and sharing your wisdom. You've helped so many people by doing this work and helping them turn their pain into purpose, which is exactly what I want this space to be about. And let people know that healing isn't just possible, but it's expected. We expect people to heal. But I love to keep this dialogue going and explore ways we could serve the creative community together as well. Yes.
That's awesome.
So,
Thank you for doing the work that you do. They're important conversations.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So there you have it behind the spotlight, Kelly Wright.